Some stories defy belief, stretching the bounds of reality until they snap. But in a galaxy teeming with wonders and terrors, even the wildest tale can hold a seed of truth. And this story, well, this is the one that changed everything. And then, get this, the human just walked up to it. Zarnell's tentacles waved frantically as he recounted the tale to his fellow Galactic Union officers. The cantina buzzed with the usual chatter of a dozen different species, but a hush fell over the immediate vicinity as the Cordion's crystalline voice rose in pitch. Walked up to what? Vrixtharn, a Vespidian with iridescent wings, leaned in closer, antennae twitching with curiosity. The war machine. Zarnell's eye stalks bobbed emphatically. You know, one of those Kazarn deathbringers, the kind that can level a small city. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. The Kazarn were notorious for their brutally efficient killing machines, towering monstrosities of metal and energy weapons that had laid waste to countless worlds. But that's impossible, stuttered Glorn, a gelatinous blob from the Andromeda galaxy. His amorphous form quivered with disbelief. No sentient being can withstand even being in the proximity of a Kazarn war machine. The radiation alone would... Well, apparently nobody told the human that, Zarnell interrupted, his crystalline structure glittering with excitement. Because not only did he walk up to it, The Courtian paused for dramatic effect, reveling in the rapt attention of his audience. He what? Someone shouted from the back. He punched it. The cantina erupted in a cacophony of disbelief, laughter, and outright dismissal. Now you're just making things up, Vrixtharn buzzed, his wings fluttering in agitation. Next, he'll tell us the human defeated it with interpretive dance. Zarnell's eye stalks swiveled to fix the Vespidian with a hard stare. I grumble on the crystal minds of Sarlaith. Every word is true. I saw it with my own optical receptors. As the debate raged on around him, a figure at the far end of the bar chuckled softly to himself. Commander Ethan Voss of the Earth Defense Force took another swig of his Rigelian ale, savoring the burn as it slid down his throat. These aliens had no idea. Clearing his throat, Jake stood up, his imposing 6'2" frame drawing all eyes in the cantina. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted beings of indeterminate gender, he began, a roguish grin playing across his scarred face. Allow me to introduce myself, Commander Ethan Voss at your service, and I believe I can shed some light on this fascinating tale. The silence that fell was so complete, you could have heard a pick-tick feather drop. Jake sauntered over to the group, his cybernetic left arm glinting in the dim light of the cantina. Now, our crystalline friend here, Jake nodded towards Zarnell, has the broad strokes right. But as they say back on Earth, the devil's in the details. Jake pulled up a chair, spinning it around and straddling it backwards, his arms resting on the backrest. It all started about 3 standard cycles ago. I was leading a recon mission on Proxima Centauri B. The dropship bucked and weaved through the turbulent atmosphere of Proxima Centauri B, its heat shields glowing an angry red. Inside, Ethan Voss gripped the overhead handrail, his knuckles white beneath the skin-tight smart fabric of his combat suit. "Everybody remember where we parked?" he shouted over the roar of the engines, eliciting a few nervous chuckles from his squad. As the ship touched down with a bone-jarring thud, Jake's HUD flickered to life, overlaying the interior of the dropship with a wealth of tactical information. Outside, the barren landscape of Proxima Centauri B stretched as far as the eye could see, a desolate wasteland of rust-colored rocks and swirling dust storms. "All right, ladies and gents," Jake addressed his team as the dropship's ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss. "Standard recon protocol. We're here to gather intel on Kazarn activity in the system, not to engage. Keep your eyes open and your triggers cold. Clear?" A chorus of "Clear, sir," echoed through the hold. As they filed out onto the alien world, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The intel suggested minimal Kazarn presence in this sector, but years of combat experience had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. They'd barely made it a click from the landing site when chaos erupted. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, a low rumble that quickly grew to a deafening roar. Jake's HUD exploded with warnings as massive energy signatures lit up the battlefield. "Scatter!" Jake bellowed, diving for cover behind a nearby boulder. Not a moment too soon, as the Earth erupted in a geyser of superheated plasma, leaving a smoking crater where he'd been standing seconds before. As the dust settled, Jake's blood ran cold. Looming over the battlefield, its massive form blotting out the dim light of Proxima Centauri, stood a Kazarn war machine. "Well, here we go," Jake whispered, his mind racing through possible scenarios, each bleaker than the last. The war machine towered at least 30 meters high, its insectoid form bristling with weaponry. Energy crackled along its carapace, and Jake's suit sensors screamed warnings about the lethal levels of radiation it was emitting. "Command, this is Foxtrot Actual," Jake sub-vocalized into his comms. "We've got a serious problem here. Kazarn presence is significantly higher than expected, requesting immediate evac and orbital support." The response came back garbled with static. "Negative Foxtrot Awal. Heavy on orms in the upper atmo here. No orbit support possible. Evac 20 minutes. Jake swore colorfully. Employing several languages and some creative anatomy, 20 minutes might as well be an eternity with that monstrosity bearing down on them. "Sir," it was Sergeant Mira Elan, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Hale and Vaughn are pinned down by that thing's plasma caster. They can't move without getting vaporized." Jake peered around the edge of his cover, assessing the situation. Hale and Vaughn were indeed trapped, huddled behind the rapidly melting remains of their hover tank. The war machine loomed over them, its weapon systems charging for another salvo. In that moment, Jake made a decision that would later be described as either the bravest or the most insane act in human military history, quite possibly both. Elan, on my mark, lay down suppressing fire on that brute's optical sensors, and someone get me the biggest, nastiest EMP grenade we've got. "Sir," Ellen's voice cracked with disbelief. "What are you planning?" Jake grinned a fierce, feral expression that would have given even the most hardened Kazarn warrior pause. "I'm going to introduce our oversized friend there to a little thing we humans like to call percussive maintenance." Before anyone could object, Jake burst from cover, sprinting full tilt towards the war machine. Behind him, he heard Elan barking orders, and a moment later, the air was filled with the staccato rhythm of pulse rifles. The war machine's head swiveled towards the new threat, its targeting systems momentarily confused by the barrage of fire peppering its sensors. It was all the opening Jake needed. As he closed the distance, time seemed to slow. Jake could hear his heartbeat thundering in his ears, feel the adrenaline surging through his veins. The war machine's plasma caster began to glow, preparing to reduce him to his component atoms. 10 meters. Jake's cybernetic arm whirred as he primed the EMP grenade. 5 meters. The air crackled with energy as the plasma caster reached full charge. 2 meters. Jake leaped, his augmented muscles catapulting him far higher than any unmodified human could hope to achieve. For a moment he was eye to eye with the towering behemoth. "Smut, you overgrown toaster," Jake growled and slammed the EMP grenade into a gap in the war machine's armor plating. The world went white. When Jake's vision cleared, he found himself lying on his back, staring up at the alien sky. Every nerve ending in his body was screaming, and the acrid smell of ozone filled his nostrils. But he was alive. Groaning, Jake pushed himself to his feet, his cybernetic arm twitching and sparking from the EMP blast. The war machine stood frozen, arcs of electricity dancing across its surface as its systems tried to reboot. "Oh, no you don't," Jake whispered. He strode forward, ignoring the protests of his battered body, and drew back his organic fist. With a yell that was equal parts pain, fury, and sheer human stubbornness, Ethan Voss punched the Kazarn war machine square in what passed for its face. The impact reverberated through the bare battlefield like a thunderclap. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the world's largest tin can being crushed, the war machine's head caved in, its legs buckled, and the massive construct toppled backwards, crashing to the ground with an earth-shaking impact. Silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the pinging of cooling metal and the soft whir of Jake's malfunctioning cybernetic arm. "Unbelievable," someone whispered over the comms. Jake wasn't sure if it was one of his team or his own voice. Slowly, the rest of the squad emerged from cover, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief as they stared at the fallen war machine. "Commander," Aylin said, her voice barely above a whisper, "did you just punch out a Kazarn war machine?" Jake looked down at his hand, the knuckles bloody and already beginning to swell. He flexed his fingers experimentally, wincing at the pain. "Apparently," he said, a note of surprise in his own voice. Then, because sometimes the universe hands you the perfect straight line, he added, "Guess you could say I really knocked some sense into it." The groan that rippled through the squad was music to Jake's ears. Back in the present, the cantina had fallen into a stunned silence as Jake finished his tale. He leaned back in his chair, taking another swig of his ale, and savoring the looks of disbelief on the aliens' faces. That's impossible, Talork," the gelatinous blob finally managed to sputter. "The radiation alone should have turned me into a walking nightlight," Jake finished for him, grinning. "Yeah, that's what the doc said too. Apparently us humans are a bit more radiation resistant than your average sentient. Something about our evolutionary history and exposure to background radiation on Earth. Who knew? But the force required to damage a Kazarn war machine," Vrixtharn buzzed, his wings twitching in agitation. "No organic being could generate that kind of power." Jake's grin widened. "You'd be surprised what the human body is capable of when you pump it full of adrenaline and experimental combat stims." Plus, he flexed his organic arm, the muscles rippling beneath his uniform. "We Deathworlders tend to pack a bit more punch than your average spacefaring species." Zixnave's eye stalked swiveled between Jake and the rest of the group. "See, I told you it was true." "Hold on now," Jake said, holding up a hand. "Our crystalline friend here might have seen what happened, but he's missing some crucial context. That war machine, it wasn't at full power when I took it down." A ripple of confusion passed through the gathered aliens. "You see," Jake continued, leaning in conspiratorially, "that EMP grenade I used, it didn't just scramble the machine's systems. It also disrupted the energy field that usually protects these things. So when I punched it, I wasn't just hitting metal. I was hitting a very precisely engineered weak point." But paused, letting that sink in. "Don't get me wrong, it still hurt like crazy. But I didn't just walk up and deck a fully operational war machine. That would be suicide, even for a Deathworlder." The aliens exchanged glances, a mix of relief and lingering awe in their expressions. Jake could practically see the gears turning in their heads as they reassessed their view of humanity. But still, Vrixtharn said slowly, to even approach such a machine, let alone damage it, it's unprecedented. Jake shrugged, a casual gesture at odds with the gravity of the conversation. That's kind of our thing, you know? Doing the unprecedented. It's how we survived on Earth, and it's how we're making our mark out here in the galaxy. He stood up, stretching muscles that still ached from time to time when he remembered that day on Proxima Centauri B. Look, I'm not saying humans are invincible. We're not. We bleed, we break, we die, just like any other censored species. But what makes us dangerous, what makes us Deathworlders, is that we never, ever give up. Jake's eyes swept across the gathered aliens, his expression suddenly serious. We come from a world that tried to neutralize us every single day of our evolution. Predators, diseases, natural disasters, you name it, we've survived it. And that's given us something that a lot of species out here in the galaxy don't have. The absolute conviction that no matter how bad things get, there's always a way to fight back. He tapped his temple with his cybernetic finger. Our greatest weapon isn't our strength, or our tech, or even our stubborn refusal to lay down and die. It's this, our minds, our ability to analyze a situation, find the weak points, and exploit them, even if it means doing something as crazy as punching a war machine. The cantina had fallen silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with contemplation rather than disbelief. Jake could see the dawning realization in their eyes, the understanding that humanity wasn't just another spacefaring race, but something altogether different, something that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. And so the next time you hear a story about a human doing something impossible, Jake said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room, don't dismiss it out of hand. Ask yourself, what did they see that no one else did? What solution did they find that no one else thought to look for? He raised his glass in a toast. Because that, my friends, is the true power of humanity. Not our fists, but our minds. And trust me, we're just getting started. And as Jake drained the last of his ale, he couldn't help but smile at the looks of mingled fear and admiration on the aliens' faces. It was an expression he'd seen more and more often lately as humanity made its presence known across the stars. They were right to be a little afraid, he mused. Humanity was a force to be reckoned with, no doubt about it. But fear wasn't the whole story, because along with that wariness came a grudging respect, and even a hint of excitement. After all, the galaxy was a big, dangerous place, and having a species around that specialized in doing the impossible, well, that just might come in handy someday. As Jake made his way out of the cantina, he overheard snippets of conversation starting up behind him. Debates about human physiology, speculation about Earth's environment, and more than a few odd retellings of his story. He chuckled to himself. If they thought punching out a war machine was impressive, just wait until they heard about some of humanity's other exploits. The Void Kraken incident, for instance, or the Great Dyson Sphere heist. But those, Jake decided, as he stepped out into the bustling spaceport, were stories for another day. For now, he had a mission briefing to attend. After all, the galaxy wasn't going to save itself, and if that meant occasionally punching something much, much bigger than himself, well, that was just another day at the office for a human Deathworlder. As Jake made his way through the crowded spaceport, his mind drifted back to the faces in the cantina. The awe, the fear, the dawning realization of what humanity truly represented in the grand scheme of the galaxy. It was a look he'd seen countless times, since humans had burst onto the interstellar scene, and it never failed to give him a little thrill. But with that thrill came responsibility. Jake knew all too well that humanity's reputation as unstoppable badasses was both a blessing and a curse. Sure, it kept a lot of potential enemies at bay, but it also painted a target on their backs. Every up-and-coming species with something to prove, every ancient civilization feeling threatened by the new kids on the block. They all saw humanity as the ultimate challenge. Jake's comm unit buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He tapped his earpiece and Admiral Rhea Solis's voice filled his ear. "Martinez, where on earth are you? The briefing started 5 minutes ago." Jake winced. He'd lost track of time in the cantina. "On my way, Admiral." Got held up spreading the good word about humanity's greatness. He could practically hear Ellen's eye roll. "Save the PR for the diplomats, Martinez. We've got bigger fish to fry." "How big are we talking?" Jake asked, picking up his pace. "Tuna big or Void Kraken big?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Ellen spoke again, her voice was grim. "Remember that war machine you took down on Proxima Centauri B?" Jake's blood ran cold. "Yeah." Turns out it was just the tip of the iceberg. We've detected a massive Kazarin fleet massing at the edge of the system. And this time, they're not sending the B-team. Jake swore under his breath. The war machine he'd faced had been bad enough. A full invasion fleet. That was the stuff of nightmares. "I'll be there in 2 minutes," he said, breaking into a run. "Make it 1, Ellen replied and cut the connection. As Jake sprinted through the spaceport, dodging startled aliens and leaping over luggage, his mind was already racing through scenarios. The Kazarin were tough, no doubt about it, but they'd never faced humanity in mass before. And if there was one thing Jake knew, it was that you should never underestimate a human with their back against the wall. He burst into the briefing room, slightly out of breath, to find it packed with the top brass of the Earth Defense Force. Admiral Rhea Solis shot him a glare that could have melted steel, but Jake just flashed her his most disarming grin as he slid into his seat. "Nice of you to join us, Commander," Ellen said dryly. "Now, as I was saying, the situation is critical. The Kazarn fleet outnumbers us 10 to 1, and their technology is at least a generation ahead of ours in most areas." Holoprojectors hummed to life, filling the room with a 3D map of the star system. Red dots representing the Kazarn ships swarmed at the edges, while a pitiful handful of blue dots clustered around Earth and its colonies. "Conventional wisdom says we don't stand a chance," Elan continued, "but conventional wisdom hasn't met humanity yet." As she turned to Jake, "Commander Martinez, you've had more direct experience with Kazarn tech than anyone else in this room. What can you tell us about their weaknesses?" Jake stood, his cybernetic arm whirring softly as he gestured at the holographic display. "Their biggest strength is also their Achilles heel," he began. "The Kazarn rely heavily on energy field technology for defense, for weapons, hell, even for propulsion. It's incredibly advanced stuff, light years ahead of what we can produce." He paused, a sly grin spreading across his face. "But you know what they say about putting all your eggs in one basket. If we can disrupt those energy fields, we can turn their own tech against them," Ellen finished, a predatory gleam in her eye. "Exactly," Jake nodded. "The EMP grenade I used on that war machine was just a proof of concept. Imagine if we could scale that up, create a weapon that could knock out the energy fields of an entire fleet." The room erupted in excited chatter. Jake could see the hope kindling in the eyes of his fellow officers. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A crack in the seemingly impenetrable armor of the Kazarn threat. Admiral Rhea Solis raised a hand, silencing the room. "It's a good idea, Martinez, but we don't have time to develop and test a new superweapon. The Kazarn will be here in less than 72 hours. Jake's grin didn't falter. "With all due respect, Admiral, who said anything about developing a new weapon?" He strode to the holodisplay, manipulating it with practiced ease. The view zoomed in on Earth, then further, until they were looking at a familiar sight. The old International Space Station, long since decommissioned and replaced by more advanced orbital habitats. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake said, his voice filled with the kind of crazy confidence that had become humanity's trademark. "Allow me to introduce you to the biggest EMP generator in human history." The room fell silent as the implication sank in. It was Admiral Rhea Solis who finally broke the silence. "You want to turn the ISS into a weapon?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and grudging admiration. Jake nodded. "It's perfect. The station is already in a stable orbit. It's got the size and the power systems we need. And best of all, the Kazarn won't see it as a threat. To them it'll look like a quaint relic of humanity's early space age." He turned to face the room, his eyes blazing with determination. "We've got 72 hours to turn a museum piece into the galaxy's biggest bug zapper. It's insane, it's unprecedented, and it just might save the human race." His gaze swept across the assembled officers. "Who's with me?" For a moment, nobody moved. Then slowly at first, but with growing enthusiasm, hands began to raise. Within seconds, every person in the room was on their feet, a chorus of "I" filling the air. Admiral Rhea Solis shook her head, but Jake could see the smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I must be out of my mind," she whispered. Then louder, "All right, people, you heard the man. We've got a space station to weaponize and a galaxy to save. Let's move." As the room emptied, officers rushing off to begin the monumental task ahead, Jake found himself alone with the Admiral. "You know," Ellen said, her voice softer than usual, "when I first met you, I thought you were nothing but a cocky hotshot with more guts than brains." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Elin clapped him on the shoulder. "Now I think you might be the crazy brute who saves us all." She paused, her expression growing serious. "But Jake, if this doesn't work..." "It'll work," Jake said with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. Elin nodded. "It better, because if it doesn't, there won't be a human left alive to second-guess your plan." So with that sobering thought, she strode out of the room, leaving Jake alone with a slowly rotating hologram of Earth. He stared at the blue-green orb, so fragile and yet so resilient, home to a species that had clawed its way up from the primordial ooze, survived ice ages and asteroid impacts, and now stood as the last line of defense against a threat that could extinguish all life in the galaxy. "Don't worry, old girl," Jake murmured to the image of Earth. "We're not done yet, not by a long shot." With a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and marched out of the briefing room. He had a space station to turn into a superweapon, a fleet of alien invaders to outsmart, and a planet to save. Just another day in the life of a human death-worlder. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. The entire resources of Earth and its colonies were thrown into Project Thunderbolt, as Jake's insane plan had been dubbed. Engineers worked around the clock, retooling the ISS's aging systems into a massive EMP generator. Scientists argued over frequencies and power outputs, trying to find the perfect combination to disrupt the Kazarn energy fields without frying every electronic device on Earth. And through it all, Jake found himself at the center of a storm of activity, troubleshooting problems, making split-second decisions, and somehow keeping everyone focused on the seemingly impossible task ahead. As the deadline approached, Jake stood in the control room of the newly christened Thunderbolt station, surrounded by banks of monitors and nervous technicians. Admiral Rhea Solis's face filled the main view screen, her expression tense. "Status report, Commander," she barked. Jake glanced at the readouts in front of him. "Thunderbolt is online and charged to 95% capacitors. Admiral, we're as ready as we'll ever be." Elan nodded grimly. "The Kazarn fleet has entered the system. They'll be in range in approximately 30 minutes. A hush fell over the control room. This was it, the moment that would decide the fate of humanity, and quite possibly the entire galaxy. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of billions of lives on his shoulders. But instead of crushing him, it steeled his resolve. This was what humans did best, facing impossible odds and finding a way to win. "All right, people," he said, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "I know we're all scared. Hell, I'm terrified. But remember why we're here. Remember what we're fighting for." He gestured to a small view screen showing a live feed of Earth. "That's our home down there. The cradle of our species, the birthplace of every dream, every hope, every crazy idea that's brought us to the stars. And I'll be damned if we're going to let some oversized bugs take it from us." A nervous chuckle rippled through the room, breaking some of the tension. "We've got one shot at this," Jake continued. "One chance to show the Kazarn and every other species out there what happens when you back a human into a corner. So let's make it count. Let's show them why you should never ever underestimate a Deathworlder." Cheer went up from the technicians, fear giving way to determination. Jake grinned, feeling the familiar surge of pre-battle adrenaline. "Admiral," he said, turning back to the main screen, "we're ready on your command." Ellen nodded, her eyes glinting with fierce pride. "Give 'em hell, Martinez." The next 30 minutes felt like an eternity. Jake watched on the tactical displays as the Kazarn fleet approached, their ships arranged in perfect formation. It was beautiful, in a terrifying sort of way. "They're entering optimal range," a technician called out. Jake took a deep breath. "Initiate Thunderbolt sequence." The control room sprang into action, fingers flying over keyboards as final adjustments were made. "Energy buildup at 100%, another tech reported. Firing solution locked." Jake's hand hovered over the large red button that would unleash their last, best hope for survival. He thought of all the aliens in that cantina, of their awe and fear at the stories of human resilience. He thought of Earth, of all the billions of lives depending on this moment. "From our world to yours," he whispered, "with love." He slammed his hand down on the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the universe itself tearing apart, a wave of electromagnetic energy burst forth from the station. Jake watched, heart in his throat, as the pulse raced towards the Kazarn fleet. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. As the EMP wave washed over the alien armada, ship after ship went dark. Energy fields flickered and died. Weapon systems sputtered and failed. And in the blink of an eye, the most fearsome invasion force the galaxy had ever seen was reduced to a collection of very expensive, very useless chunks of metal. The control room erupted in cheers, techs hugging each other and shouting in disbelief. On the main screen, Admiral Rhea Solis's face broke into a wide grin. "Unbelievable," she breathed. "You actually did it, Martinez." Jake let out a laugh that was part relief, part hysteria. Never doubt a Deathworlder, Admiral. As the reality of their victory sank in, Jake's mind was already racing ahead. The Kazaran threat had been neutralized, but this was just the beginning. Humanity had proven itself on the galactic stage in a way that no one could ignore. There would be consequences, of course. Other species would look at Earth with new eyes, some with respect, others with fear. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, and humanity was now firmly at the center of it all. But as Jake looked around at the jubilant faces of his fellow humans, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever challenges the universe threw at them next, humanity would face them head-on, because that's what Deathworlders did. They survived, they adapted, they overcame, and sometimes, just sometimes, they saved the whole darn galaxy. As the celebrations continued around him, Jake allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Not bad for a day's work, he thought. Not bad at all. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of humanity's grand adventure among the stars. But that, as they say, is a story for another day.